Hey guys, what is up? I'm back. I know it's been a while since I've uploaded a series and I haven't actually stuck to it. Oh, put my hands on the wheel. But I do want to say that I'm happy to bring you guys the first episode review of Smallville Season 1, Episode 1, the review of the video. I don't have a software just yet that allows me the ability to record myself while watching videos of different, TV shows and series and stuff like that. So once I get a software like that, once I get a software that'll help me do that sort of a thing, then I promise you guys I'll be playing videos and I'll be extending my videos to, lengthier commentaries, and I'll get more in depth in what it is that I think about each and every episode that is more interesting and what works and what doesn't work. But let me just go through the first episode. As I mentioned in my previous video, this is going to be a more comprehensive review. It's not necessarily going to be something that's extremely well put together, I think is the word I would use for the in general term. Now, it starts off with, I believe it starts off with the asteroids flying towards Earth. It passes the moon or something like that, and then we get a cut into, I think, Smallville, and we get Martha and Jonathan Kent, and they're in a flower shop buying flowers from Nell Lang, I think is her name. Aunt Nell, with Lana, when she's like 5, I think. I don't know how old she was actually in that episode. I'm just going to say 5. Yeah, I'm just going to say 5. Anyways, we get a cataclysmic meteor shower event that kills Lana's parents, and is the meteor shower that introduces us to Clark and the Kent family adopting him as their own. Then we cut to present day, which is 2001, like 15 years later, because that wouldn't make sense. Anyways, he's a freshman in high school, and he's on his day to his first day of school, right? And he's going. Now, the antagonist of this episode isn't necessarily an important piece of the episode. It's more about the story and development of Clark Kent as a young man, showing exactly what it is that he goes through on a regular basis, being someone who can't even get around Lana Lang, and he doesn't even know why. He just feels sick whenever he gets around her, but he really wants to be around her because she's pretty. Anyways, yeah, Clark Kent goes through his first day, right? They were going to sign up for football, but Clark's dad doesn't want him to, so he doesn't sign up for football. In this episode, we get introduced to Chloe Sullivan, who has the Wall of Weirds, a project she's been working on in the school newspaper since she got put on the school newspaper. The Wall of Weird is a bunch of strange radioactive things and whatnot, different mutations that have happened in different creatures, so on and so forth. Since the meteor shower that hadn't happened necessarily prior to that in Smallville, and it just kind of popped up after the meteor shower. Clark Kent finds out in this episode, we're introduced to Lex Luthor in an interesting way. Lex Luthor is driving to a mansion in Smallville. He's driving angrily, he's not paying attention to the road, and he loses control of the car and actually hits Clark, and they go off a bridge into a river, and Lex is surely going to die if Clark doesn't rescue him. So Clark, swims down, pries the hood of the car off, the top of the car, pries the top of the car off, and rescues Lex Luthor. After this, Lex Luthor takes a fascination in Clark, not only because Clark saved his life and he feels indebted to him, but also because there's no way that should have worked. Like, he thought that he hit Clark 60 miles per hour, right? Yeah. And he did. So we get the introduction into Lex Luthor and his obsessive compulsive behavior and his obsessive need to constantly know every little detail, which is an important piece of the character and an important character attribute that Lex Luthor has to go through in order to be a good Lex Luthor character. And we get to see within the first 10 minutes of the show the good-heartedness of Clark Kent and his good-hearted nature and his sense of morality and his responsibility, the thing that he feels is burdening his chest. And we see the quirkiness of Chloe Sullivan and the fact that she's wants to be a reporter and she's got all these strange theories that she hasn't quite figured out the actual answers to just yet. And we're introduced to Pete Ross. We get a lot less information about Pete Ross in this episode, like as we do to Chloe Sullivan, Clark Kent, Lana Lang, and Lex Luthor. But to put it simply, Pete Ross is a character that we're introduced to as Clark's best and closest friend. I love the interaction that Pete Ross and Clark Kent have throughout the seasons that Pete Ross was still on the show. And it's really heartbreaking to see him go when he does go. But at the same time, this first episode just brings this childlike wonder to this character of Pete Ross. He's just this undying friend. He's such a good-hearted guy who just doesn't care what wrongs Clark Kent has done. He just likes to be Clark's friend, and that's one thing that Clark doesn't really have. He's kind of a loner. But it's really nice to see Pete Ross as a super supportive, good guy who just wants to see his friend do good and do well in school. And that's probably my favorite aspect of the Pete Ross character in this first episode. He's even trying to look out for Clark by saying, "Hey, we need to join the football team because if we don't, we're going to be turned into scarecrows." I mean, we can join the football team, and then after the formal, we can just not be on the football team anymore. But we want to be a part of the football team so that we don't have to worry about getting hung up as a scarecrow out in Potter's Field. I think is what the field where the scarecrows get hung, right? So yeah, and we get introduced to this character who you think is a bully for the show, but in reality turns out to have a very interesting character arc. But for the first episode, he's more of a bully who just kind of gets away with it and winds up being this character that gets the girl at the end of the episode. Whitney, what's his last name? I can't remember his last name, but anyways, his first name is Whitney, and he's a football player. He's the quarterback. He's dating Lana Lang, and that makes a little interesting love triangle between Clark Kent, Lana Lang, and Whitney. Clark Kent is this guy who constantly saves people's lives, and Whitney is this guy who throws around a football, as is put by Lex Luthor, I think in maybe episode 2, episode 3, I don't know. But almost every character that has some sort of level of importance in Clark's life throughout the first season is introduced in this first episode. We've got Pete Ross, Chloe Sullivan, we've got Ma and Pa Kent, we've got Lana Lang, and we've got Whitney. I still can't remember his last name for some strange reason. Whitney Foreman, Lex Luthor, and we're even introduced to Lex Luthor's father, Lionel Luthor, I do believe. I could be wrong. But we get a lot of interesting character developments from Lex Luthor and Clark Kent primarily. Clark Kent finds out he's an alien, so he freaks out, he goes to a graveyard. And what's really interesting about that scene, what's really interesting about Clark going to the graveyard, is that he's finding himself to be the person who's responsible for the death of those people on that day. And he's going to that graveyard to talk to people in a graveyard and ask for forgiveness. Clark Kent is in that graveyard in that first episode because he feels guilty and he feels responsible for their deaths, for the people who died that day of the meteor shower. And then he comes to find out that the girl he likes was killed in the her parents were killed in the meteor shower. So he feels even more guilty and even more distant from most average people. I thought that was a very interesting little twist on the character of Superman that most people don't really get to see. A lot of times people just see Superman as this bustling Boy Scout in blue, right? But they don't ever see the immense burden that's on his chest, that he's carrying around with him almost every day, right? And this episode introduces us to Clark Kent, to a version of Superman that actually predominantly has him feeling guilty for the things that he thinks he's responsible for. And he really wants to be normal. I mean, he really does want to be just like everyone else throughout the first episode, but he needs to use his abilities to stop the bad guy from being the bad guy. And the bad guy is just a scarecrow who's in a coma, who wants revenge. Like I said, the antagonist isn't necessarily an important character. He's in that episode and that episode alone, and he shocks himself out of being a bad guy, and he gets rehabilitated. That's really that character's arc. He's not necessarily an important character. He's kind of like a male version of Livewire. He can feed off of electricity, and he can electrocute people, and he can manipulate electrical currents. But at the same time, he's not necessarily that much of an important piece to the actual show. I mean, the first episode primarily centers around Clark Kent and his guilt, and the mending and building of relationships. For instance, we get a little line from Lex Luthor about knowing what it's like to be different, because he was bald since he was like, what, 10, I think it was? 8 or 9? Somewhere, very young. I think maybe even single digits. He became bald because of the meteor shower. And he's talking to Clark, and Clark's just like, yeah, kind of different, and so it's like, well, Lex just says, don't worry, I'm used to people judging me. I was bald since I was a kid. I get what it's like to be different, and so that creates a friendship between this guy who's like the prodigal son of Metropolis, right? This Lex Luthor, millionaire, billionaire son, and we have a farm kid who's just good-hearted and wants to help people, Clark Kent. And we get that dichotomy, we get that yin-yang, but one has a darker story, and one has a brighter story. And they both have to go on a journey with each other to find what that darkened journey, to find what that darkened character arc and that lightened character arc is. So I really like the inclusion of Clark Kent having a friendship with Lex Luthor. Although it doesn't make sense originally, because you're like, hold on, why is Clark Kent friends with Lex Luthor? Isn't that going to put a hindrance on them, being worst enemies in the future? But the way the show handles it overall is pretty impressive, and I was curious to see when I first started watching the show how it is they were going to fix this. And I really love the way that the constant back and forth between Clark and Lex Luthor's friendship eventually creates such an interesting, dramatized version of a real-life friendship, where you can have the best intentions, and as I think Jonathan Kent says in one of the future episodes of Season 1, the pathway to hell is paved with good intentions. And I love that line because it really is kind of the entire character arc of Lex Luthor on Smallville. And I mean, it really is just, the interaction that Clark Kent and Lex Luthor have in this first episode is just, like I said, incredible. It's amazing. The way that the actors all get along within this first episode, they have this childlike, this adolescence to them. They're like 20 and 25-year-old people, right, in the first episode, but they all have this, younger teenage essence to them that makes the show work despite them being fully grown adults. And I love to see the way that they interact with each other, and I love to see the differing interactions and the way that the different characters interact. And I mean, yeah, I don't really want to keep dragging on about what it is I like about what I like about the episode. I don't really have any issues with this first episode. I thought that the inclusion of the story of just Smallville and Clark Kent learning to take hold of his life and grasping, hey, it's not a waste of time for me to feel guilty. I just need to learn how to not feel guilty about every little detail. I think that that's a very interesting direction to take the first episode, and I was curious when I first started watching this to see how they took the rest of the season. And I don't think you guys are going to be disappointed either. I mean, I've watched the first season like 5 times now, and I've still loved almost every episode. There's just a couple episodes where I'm really bored with it, and I don't feel like it's necessary. It kind of feels like a filler. But at the same time, every episode is just as good as the next. And I love the inclusion of just so many interesting story arcs, and I can't wait to go through those episodes with you guys. That being said, that's all I got to say today. I'm signing off. See you next time.